Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. We've said all along that Rupert Murdoch is a hack. Everything he touches turns to garbage, unless it's a state-sponsored monopoly position where he's using his political influence to subsidize his underhanded and nefarious rent-seeking schemes. Now it turns out there's incontrovertible proof that Murdoch sponsored illegal phone hacking in the UK and around the world. That's right, the only way he can make money is by breaking the law. This guy should be in jail. Now, Stacy Herbert, in fact, you're the source of this incontrovertible proof against Rupert Murdoch. Isn't that so?
Well, I did tell Scotland Yard a few years ago that Rupert Murdoch was tapping phones. They were shocked when I said that. And I said, well, actually look inside your own police force because they're helping him. But let's move on to the big headlines, the scandalous headlines. Speaking of tabloids, Iceland warns of political and economic chaos as voters reject iSave debt deal. So 60% of the Icelandic population, when presented with another referendum on whether or not to pay back the Dutch and British savers who lost all their money in the iSave account, they voted no.
Yeah, well, the Icelandic people are standing firm against the bankster, the financial terrorists. Gotta love it.
Well, the backers of the yes vote had argued that the repayment deal was the best way to resolve the issue in terms of cost and risk to Iceland. And the no camp said the Icelandic taxpayer was under no legal obligation to pay for a private bank's losses, and that the deal would put a heavy burden on the nation, which is true, of course, because since they are the only ones outside of the Eurozone, outside of these IMF, EU imposed austerity measures, their economy is growing, while if you look at Ireland, it's getting worse and worse and worse.
That's exactly right. There are no obligation for private citizens to bail out private bankers. That's the key point. The Icelandic people say, we're not going to bail out private bankers. As a matter of fact, they're looking for these private bankers to prosecute these private bankers, as they should be looked at and found and prosecuted for committing acts of financial terrorism. And compare that with Iceland. If Iceland put all the backstopped of all the banks in Ireland, they put all the private debts on the public balance sheet, and now the people are suffering austerity measures for no reason other than to satisfy corrupt bankers. There's no economic reason for it. There's no legitimate economic reason for Ireland to suffer any economic consequences for private banking shenanigans. Icelandic people understand this. They told the private bankers, fungu!
Well, in Ireland, you see economic chaos and you see financial distress. But in Iceland, the Prime Minister, Jóhanna Sigurdóttir, she said that the worst option was chosen. We must do all we can to prevent political and economic chaos as a result of this outcome.
Well, she's a moron, because basically all she's doing is she's kowtowing and appeasing terrorism. You can never negotiate with terrorists. And this applies to bankers like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland, iSave people, the three banks that went bankrupt, any bank. They're terrorists. You can't negotiate with them.
But speaking of economic chaos, so she's warning that standing up to the bankers will cause economic chaos, because this is what they whisper in my ear. Well, let's look at the economic chaos in the headlines this week, Max. Exclusive, Bill Gross is now short U.S. debt, hikes cash to $73 billion, an all-time record. This is from Zero Hedge, and they looked at Bill Gross's books, and they saw that he's actually short U.S. Treasuries, and he's holding 30% of his funds in cash.
Well, this is remarkable because Bill Gross manages the biggest bond fund in the world, and if he doesn't like treasuries, he can get out of all of his treasuries. If he fears inflation, or hyperinflation, as some are arguing, he can get out of his treasury bonds. But for this huge fund to sell short treasury bonds and make a bet that inflation is baked into the cake and use the enormous buying power of his multi-$100 billion fund, he can swing the market to create this outcome in what George Soros calls his theory of, not reciprocity, but some other fancy term, where the market maker themselves can create the outcome by the sheer size and volume of their trades. So Gross, by shorting treasury bonds, he's causing panic in the market. And the people who were in those treasury bonds now, who realize that they'll never get paid back, they're looking around for some place to put their money. Oh, what do I see? Gold and silver, gold.
Well, exactly.
Sorry.
Well, the theory is called reflexivity, Max. And if you look at the headlines, the first thing Monday morning, once everybody realized that Bill Gross is actually shorting U.S. Treasuries, pre-market summary, inflationary hysteria. So you see the charts from gold, silver, oil, and corn skyrocketing. First thing, silver was up to almost $42.
I'm so excited by this. I'm thinking about going back to my original career back in the late 70s as a go-go dancer at a lesbian bar in Greenwich Village. And I used to wear pasties and I could get them going in opposite directions. That's how excited I am about the price of gold and silver hitting new all-time record highs and doubling and tripling from here. I may bring that back to this show.
Well, of course, all of it comes back to the dollar. The dollar is the thing that's falling. And you see this in this headline, Max, Americans to Fed. Prices are too high. They're saying that inflation is a lot higher than what the Fed is telling them it is because they experience the gas pump every single day.
Well, look, the Fed looks at the economy and they decide to adjust their monetary policy according to only 3 economic indicators: house prices, wages, and computer chips. All of those 3 things happen to be going down in price, and the Fed says, oh, there's deflation, therefore we must keep rates at 0%. They don't look at gas, they don't look at precious metals, they don't look at food. They don't look at now clothes. They don't look at the stuff at Walmart now going up in price because the wage arbitrage in China is finished, as people in China are now negotiating higher wages than people in America are getting. So the Fed looks at only a few items and they conclude that they don't see inflation. Why does the Fed do this? Because 0% interest rates means that the banks on Wall Street can borrow money at 0, and then they can cycle it back through the Treasury repurchase program and get 2 or 3% on their money, and they can just print money all day long, which of course is the same as inflating your money supply. And this is what Bill Gross sees. He sees rampant fraud. He's taking a political position. He's attacking America. Bill Gross has taken the position of taking a huge axe. He's an axe murderer when it comes to the American economy by shorting U.S. Treasuries to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. The U.S. Treasury bond market is fakakta. It's toast. It's meaningless. It's schmagegi. I wouldn't have my dog own a U.S. Treasury bond. They're going to collapse. And I'm sorry.
Yeah, but the American
there.
consumer is now desperate and in pain. But at the time, they were laughing at Jimmy McMillan last year during the elections. Let's take a clip of him.
I represent the rent is too damn high party. The people I'm here to represent can't afford to pay their rent. They're being laid off right now as I speak. They can't eat breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Listen, someone's stomach, child's stomach just growled.
And you hear the chuckles there, Max. People were laughing. And what did they do? They voted for Andrew Cuomo, who, what did he do as soon as he came into office this year? He gave a tax break to the very bankers that have caused the economic chaos, which is distressing them.
He appeased the terrorists again. I mean, why are they so up the schwing of the financial terrorists, Andrew Cuomo? I mean, can he breathe up there? Does he have enough oxygen to breathe with his head firmly up the schwing of the financial terrorists on Wall Street? Andrew, hello, Earth to Andrew.
So let's look at another situation, another crime wave that is part and parcel of this banking crime wave. On the trail of the scrap metal crime wave. So this is in the UK, and because of the escalating price of copper, people are stealing copper wiring from the rail system, from electrical systems, and leaving tens of thousands of people with no electricity and forcing the railroads to shut down for hours on end. And Tony Glover of industry group Energy Network says, it is pathetic. Quite frankly, as a crime, it is sometimes as little as 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 20 pounds, never more than 100 pounds worth in terms of the value of the copper. Well, you could say the same thing about bankers, Max, because they've taken down a $65 trillion global economy for $100 billion in bonuses for Christmas.
Yeah, if you put the scale from one to make a comparison, that's right. I mean, when Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, when they throw the entire $65 trillion global economy under the bus to make a few $1 million bonus, I mean, they're for a few pennies. They're sacrificing the entire global economy, and they're sacrificing the entire global ecology. Remember, you got guys like BP who are willing to, for a few bucks, destroy the Gulf of Mexico. For a few bucks, destroy the ecology's ability to create the free air, water, and food that's been available for free for hundreds of thousands of years. They're sacrificing that aspect of the ecology for a few bucks, just like the banks are sacrificing the ability of the global economy to create enough liquidity for there to be day-to-day operational facilities for a few bucks. So this is why I say they're terrorists. They're willing to kill themselves and others for a penny.
The global financial system has been blown up by suicide bankers, but they didn't do it alone. And just like these scrap metal thieves don't do it alone. They deliver the stolen metal to scrap yards in the UK, which willfully turn a blind eye, according to the article. He says some openly advertise themselves as hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil services.
Well, yeah, just like the primary dealers.
Yeah.
There are primary dealers on Wall Street that deal with the government and the Fed, who launder the money for the Fed, and they hear no evil, see no evil, even though they're participating in an enormous Ponzi scheme and fraud.
And the rating agencies who hear no evil, see no evil in the various derivative products to which they're presented with.
No, they give it a AAA rating.
Yes.
For fraud, AAA rated fraud.
And then finally, if volume is the weapon of the bull, then ... If you see this chart, it's comparing the U.S. trading stock volume, that's the line in white, versus the S&P, that's in green. And you see the dramatic rise in stocks was accompanied by a dramatic collapse in volume.
Because the trading is done through computer trading. It's all fake trading. The insiders have been net sellers in record amounts as they take their cash out of the market and they buy gold and silver, but they have the computers buying and selling to keep a simulated facade of market participation for public consumption by those idiots like James Cramer and CNBC, who don't mention the fact that underneath the surface, all the volume is being drained out of the system by the top 1% criminal terrorists on Wall Street. It's like that Indiana Jones movie, remember, when he's trying to take that object out of the cave and he swaps it for a bag of sand, and then he looks behind him and there's an enormous boulder that chases him down the tunnel, okay? That enormous boulder is called inflation. Bill Gross knows this. That's why he's shorting Treasury bonds. And the American people are going to wake up one day and say, wait a minute, S&P's down 30% a day? What happened? I thought that people well bid for these stocks. No, the computers were buying the stocks. The actual people with money got out months ago, you frickin' sucker.
Yeah, well, his conclusion is this chart is saying the bull market is bogus. It's all intervention, and it's an intervention in order to basically continue that redistribution of wealth from the bottom 99% up to the top 1%.
Well, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to London and talk with award-winning author, blogger, and founder of boingboing.net, the one, the only, Cory Doctorow. Cory, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Oh, thanks, Max. It's great to be back on. And just a small correction, I'm the co-editor, but I wasn't the founder of Boing Boing.
Okay, Cory Doctorow. Most people won't have any idea that in nations around the world, copyright legislation is being passed often without any public consultation, or that the UN is working similarly on an international level. Tell us what's happening, where, why, and by whom.
Well, actually, the really alarming thing isn't what the UN is doing. It's what the places that copyright extremists have gone to because they can't get the UN to do what they want. So it used to be that crazy copyright treaties came out of an entity called WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is, a UN specialized agency. They meet in Geneva. Their meetings are nominally open to, accredited observers. And over time, what happened was more and more observers from the technology world and the free speech world and the human rights and development world started to show up at those meetings and counter some of the talking points from the Motion Picture Association, the record companies, and so on. And it got to the point where they actually just shut down any kind of substantive copyright treaty work at the UN, and they shifted it all to what they call plurilateral negotiations. The first of these was something called ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. And ACTA was conducted almost entirely in secret. There were several periods where it leaked, but we didn't really get to know the substance of the negotiation at all. In fact, there was a point at which European parliamentarians asked to know what was being negotiated on their behalf, and were told that they weren't allowed to see the text of the treaty that was being negotiated on Europe's behalf. And it was actually kind of funny because it was such a kind of dumb way to conduct a major piece of international norm-setting treaty making that it became really easy to discredit it without having to talk about any of its particulars. I mean, the particulars were bad. At various times, ACTA drafts included requirement that governments would have to search your iPod and your laptop when you crossed into their borders. It required internet service providers to spy on users. And even the three strikes, what in France they've called Hadopi, this rule that if you were accused of 3 acts of file sharing, they'd knock your entire family off the internet for some period. You know, that stuff is pretty bad, but it's often hard to explain to people the nuances of a fairly technical copyright bill. On the other hand, pretty much everyone understood that negotiating major pieces of international law behind closed doors without inviting public interest groups and without having any scrutiny even by lawmakers, even by parliaments and Congress, was not a good way to do things. So ACTA eventually more or less collapsed under its own weight. But they're trying again with the Trans-Asian Pacific Partnership, TAPP, and it too is being negotiated in secret among a small cabal of rich countries. And when you ask them why they're negotiating this among themselves instead of taking it to the UN, they're pretty blatant about saying that the reason for it is to set a bunch of norms that can then become parts of bilateral treaties between countries. So when America makes a trade agreement with Australia or with Chile or with Colombia, it will say as a condition of signing up to our trade agreement, you also have to sign on to this Trans-Asian Pacific Partnership Agreement that you had no part in negotiating and that's actually pretty bad for your national interest.
All right, Cory Doctorow, let's take a step back for a second and discuss why copyright is a cause, why you would use a phrase like a copyright extremist. Just to give a little background to this, intellectual property comes from the public domain. The law gives creators a limited time to have a monopoly over new variations on the ideas that have come from the public domain. But after that period expires, these ideas should, as Thomas Jefferson talked about in the Constitution, return to the public domain. And what corporations want to do is they want to lock up these ideas in perpetuity, and this creates what I've called the collective global lobotomy, in that you've taken all these good ideas and you've put them on the private balance sheets of corporations. But talk a little bit more about, expanding on these themes that you write about on your site extensively, and you're really leading the charge on this very important issue, which I've always thought is the linchpin issue for activists around the world, because if you can't have access to your own thoughts, you can't really have any activist campaign against anything else. But talk a little bit more about the big picture here, Cory Doctorow.
I used to be a full-time sort of paid activist who had a sideline in the arts. I wrote novels. And then eventually my novel writing and other writing got to the point where I could quit my day job and just be a full-time participant in the arts. So I write books these days. And so my kind of parochial view of copyright is that it's really important that we have an open marketplace of ideas, and that we acknowledge that art comes from remixing other art and so on. And that used to be the thing that I really focused on when I thought about copyright and the extension of copyright and the expansion of copyright. But I've lately come to think of that as being just a little parochial. For as important as our intellectual commons are, the major casualty of extremist copyright positions these days is everything we do on the internet. Because in the name of rescuing copyright from the internet, around the world we're proposing to do things like add censorship to the very fabric of the network. So nationwide, network providers and their major interchange centers are going to have to build in censorship mechanisms where they can identify different websites and block them on a national level. We've already seen the first inklings of this in national firewalls that are supposed to prevent access to child porn. And when WikiLeaks leaked the Swedish child porn filter list, which was a secret list of websites that were blocked in Sweden in the name of being child porn, they found that something like 98.5% of those websites weren't child porn. They were just things that, for some reason or another, some bureaucrat or government person who had no accountability and no visibility into his actions found objectionable. And the easiest way to deal with it was to just shovel it into the completely opaque child porn bucket, and it just disappeared from your national network. We're adding surveillance to our networks in the name of blocking copyright infringement. So increasingly, in the US, Victoria Spinell, who's the American IP enforcement czar, has just proposed that it would be, you could obtain a search warrant to listen in on, so a wiretap warrant to listen in on someone's network connection, not because you thought that they were breaking a criminal statute, but because you thought they were infringing copyright. They're committing a civil action. And since we all infringe copyrights in ways that are small and large, because it hasn't really kept pace with the 21st century, there's not a one of us who wouldn't have vulnerability to being spied on under that rubric. We build devices now that have modes that users aren't allowed to access. So, for example, your console under your television for your video game system, or your iPad or your iPhone, all have code running on them that you can't inspect, that you can't terminate, right? They're programs that you can't shut off in them. And those programs are meant to stop you from copying files illicitly, from infringing on copyright. But designing the devices around us, the devices that aren't just, the thing that we play video games on, but also the thing that knows where we are at all times, the way that your mobile device does, even the thing that increasingly we're wearing under our skin or directly on our bodies. We have general purpose computers that we screw into our ears now that we call hearing aids. And designing those so that they can spy on or conduct actions against their users' interests without their users knowing about it, that just seems like a bad idea right from the start. So all of the stuff that we do on the internet, our banking, our civic engagement, connecting with our families, and so on, all of that is being put at risk through the copyright wars. Today, the Electronic Frontier Foundation released its amicus brief in the latest iteration of Viacom's lawsuit against YouTube. And Viacom has said that YouTube should have an obligation to examine every file that's uploaded to it to make sure it doesn't violate Viacom's copyrights. And YouTube at present gets at least 29 hours of video a minute uploaded to it. There aren't enough lawyers in the universe to examine all that video. And so what Viacom is really saying is that YouTube shouldn't accept video from all comers. They should somehow narrow down what video they accept in order to ensure that the volume is low enough that they can inspect it all and keep Viacom's copyrighted material off the network. But, any bar that you create to posting video on YouTube isn't going to just hit pirates. It's going to hit, people in Tunisia and Egypt who want to upload examples of corruption and start a revolution.
All right, so the copyright issue has morphed from a licensing issue to an issue of free speech and civil rights, basically. So they're using the technicalities and the technologies that one would ascribe to copyright and using that to shut down free speech, shut down civil rights. And I believe, just to give an example of how absurd things are going, I think Facebook is trying to copyright the word face.
Trademark it. Trademark it.
Trademark this.
Yeah.
Right, so trademark the word face as part of this land grab of intellectual property. What are we losing by allowing corporations to use copyright law and intellectual property law to corporatize thought and intellectual property on the web, something that everyone now uses pretty much every day?
Well, for a good example of what's at stake here, think about this 3 strikes proposal, that if you infringe copyright or if you're accused of infringing copyright 3 times, we take away your internet access. And there are different versions of this proposal around the world. So my wife, until pretty recently, was a commissioner at Channel 4 here in the United Kingdom. And some of the research that she commissioned was on how network access affects the poorest people in the country, people who live in council estates, who are the most vulnerable people here. And the research looked at families that were as like as possible. They had really similar circumstances, but for one difference, and that difference was internet access. And what they found was that the families who had internet access not only were able to, sort of look at YouTube or whatever, but their kids had better nutrition and got better grades in school. They had more social mobility. They got better jobs because they could cast a wider net when they were searching for employment. They saved money because they could, pay their bills electronically and save money that way. All of those benefits that accrued to them are in addition to the benefits that accrue from having universal access to all human knowledge, which is what the internet is promising to deliver and increasingly delivering upon. I mean, the kind of information that you used to have to pay for access to, whether that's information about how your government is conducting its affairs, information about how your employer or a company you're thinking and investing in conducts its affairs, the great works of literature, the great works of art, the public media that's commissioned with your money, your license fee or your tax dollars or your tax pounds or euros, all of that stuff is increasingly available at your fingertips on the internet. And we are proposing that without judicial review, without due process, without any kind of oversight, that if you're accused of downloading 3 top 40 hits, we just take it away. And we take it away not from you, but from you and everyone who lives with you. That we collectively punish your whole family for your alleged and unproved transgressions. To me, that seems like such a radically disproportionate way to deal with what is essentially a minor problem in a tiny corner of industry. You know, the entertainment companies, the 4 large record labels, the 5 large movie companies. And it seems like it's such a lot to sacrifice, even if you take them at their word that they can't possibly coexist with the internet as it's currently structured. If we have to weigh in the balance all the benefit we get from the internet and a summer's worth of, sitting in a darkened cave watching robots throw buildings at each other, as much as I like watching robots throw buildings at each other every summer, or Bruce Willis beating up a jet with his bare hands, I would easily and happily give it all up for all the stuff we get here from the internet.
Cory Doctorow, we're going to have to end it there. Cory Doctorow of boingboing.net, copyright champion. I got to go to the site and EFF.org is another key site in this debate. Thanks again for being on the Keiser Report.
Oh, well, thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Cory Doctorow of boingboing.net. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.